October 2015, Monroe County, Florida. Police are called to a bungalow in Key Largo. The scene that greets them is one of total carnage.
This was an execution-style type, home invasion type homicide.
It's probably the worst crime I've seen here in just a long, long time.
The bodies of a young couple are found lying in the house. It's clear they've been clinically executed.
It was shock. It was shock that something like this would happen in the Keys.
The kids were in this house for, more than 12 hours with their dead mother and her boyfriend.
But this is no regular homicide. The killing is linked to a bizarre set of circumstances which police begin to uncover as they start to investigate.
Is there mass murderers or someone going to house just killing people for no reason?
When you can't get the person you've lost back, all you have left is getting answers. It's just all of a sudden there was all of this evidence and they had all of these leads.
But the murderer has left a trace, one which would ultimately lead police to uncover the mystery which surrounds the killings.
Messages have been going back and forth from them all night long before the murder.
If it didn't play on him, then he has no soul.
This is the story of the Key Largo killings, what led to the deaths of those involved, and how investigators were able to use advanced forensic techniques to help solve the case. Key Largo, an area of outstanding natural beauty and a magnet for tourists from all over the world.
The Keys are a very safe community. People come down here to visit all the time. We have about 3.5 million visitors. It's a great place to live, work, and play.
It's an island-type atmosphere. We do get a lot of visitors. Obviously, we do have some crime, but the majority of it is not violent.
Tara Rosado had recently moved to the Keys to start a new life, away from the one she'd been leading in New York.
We're born in Staten Island in New York, and I was born in '86, Tara followed in '89, and the baby, Carrie, was '91.
Tara had a very loving, kind, tight-knit family. Although her parents divorced pretty early on in her life, she remained very close with her father. Her mother remarried. She was very close with her stepfather.
Our childhood was really pretty great. Our first school, we all went to the same schools. We didn't have the same friends, just the age difference, I guess, but we still did a lot together. She made me nuts sometimes, little sisters do that, but ultimately, I could never really stay mad at her. Like, she was one of the funniest people I ever knew. She was beautiful, and she was funny, and she was so smart, and I don't know what it was, but something in her just always seemed to tell her I'm not good enough, and as a result, she, wound up mixed up with people that she really had no business being around.
It seems she had bad taste in men. She had one child with a man who was not a good person from what we hear. Then she had two other children with Juan Rosado.
They were both very young, and when kids have kids, it's just, it's not the way nature intended it to be. And, it just creates problems.
So her parents wanted to keep a better eye on her. They wanted her to move to the Keys where they were.
My mom had been renting down here every year for about 6 years at that point and just loved it here. And my parents just decided it was time to think about laying down some roots here.
So her family bought her a double-wide trailer on a quiet street in the Florida Keys, and basically the hope was it could kind of reset her life and give her a fresh start to figure things out for her and her kids.
So Tara made the move to the Keys with her husband Juan and their 3 kids.
It's such a small environment. Everybody knows everybody. People genuinely care about one another here. She really was enjoying life down here.
Tara was a great mom. Everyone said great things about her. She was caring, she was good, she was kind.
She wasn't the type of person who would ignore a kid when they had a problem or who would just try to, get them in the other room. She was somebody that would listen to what her kids were going through and would do anything she could to try to help them.
Oh my God. She couldn't love her kids more.
But despite the move, her marriage to Juan continued to fall apart.
My sister and Juan separated not too long after they moved down here. They had their differences and just decided it was best to part ways.
She eventually filed for divorce in October 2014. Her family was hoping she would just focus at that point, after the divorce, on her children, on getting her life together, on working, just basically being boyfriend-free for a while. But unfortunately, she met Carlos 6 months later.
Tara ended up meeting a new boyfriend, a man named Carlos Ortiz, who, for people I talked to, was a very charming guy. He was a barber and a tattoo artist. He was, actually a very talented artist. And basically, she fell hard for this guy. They moved in together. And, whether she knew it or not, though, Carlos was also a long-time drug addict who really struggled with addiction.
Carlos Ortiz had a previous criminal record. He actually was in prison for a period of time. He had an addiction that I think continued to grow.
If you named a drug, Carlos Ortiz was probably addicted to it at some time or another. I mean, he used cocaine, he used meth, he used heroin. This was a guy with very serious drug problems.
Tara's parents definitely would not want their daughter living with or hanging out with or even dating the type of person that Carlos was.
My sister and I had our differences about her beginning to date. And as a result, it became one of those things where I don't speak to you often enough that I want to spend every conversation we have in an argument. So we started avoiding it as a topic because I didn't want to wind up in a battle with her every time I spoke to her. It got to the point where I was talking to Tara less and less throughout the course of a week, and I would call and she wasn't taking my calls, and I just assumed that it was because she knew I wasn't thrilled with the situation and was just dodging me. The last time I spoke to my sister was a very unusual call because we had kind of a joke that, if she called me to say I love you, my response was always, what do you want? Or what did you do? But this one particular evening, I was on my way home from work, and I very rarely take phone calls in the car, but as I said, she was calling me less and less. So when my phone rang and it was her, I picked up the phone. And she just said, hi, Lenny, just called to say I love you. And, I said, what do you want? And she said, nothing, I just love you. And I said, well, I love you too. I said, I'm driving, I'll call you when I get home. And she said, okay. And when I got home, I called and she didn't answer the phone.
The events that were about to take place in Tara's home would leave the peaceful community in shock.
We understood that she was making dinner that night, or had already made dinner for her children.
There was some pasta on the stove. Then she put them to bed, and little did she know at the time, when she kissed them goodnight, that was going to be the last time they saw her again.
When she put them to bed, no one could have imagined the horror her children would wake up to.
It was so shocking. It was hard to believe. It's probably the worst crime I've seen here in just a long, long time.
The Keys has its fair amount of crime, but not violent crime, and certainly not murder.
As dawn broke on the Florida Keys, the first witnesses to this brutal crime would be Tara Rosado's young children.
The kids awoke that morning, went inside, led by the older one, and discovered the body of their mother as well as Carlos.
Yeah, it's just a heartbreaking situation. The kids were in this house for, more than 12 hours with their dead mother and her boyfriend.
They were playing in the house, around the murder scene, around the bodies. There was also a dog that was tracking blood paw footprints. throughout the house. It was shocking. Must have been very horrific for those children. They were alone for so many hours, and the only reason that anyone discovered the bodies was because they came out around 2 in the afternoon the next day.
Sometime shortly before 2, all 3 kids ventured out. They carried blankets and pillows, and they went outside and started to walk down the street where they came in contact with Travis Cavadas. Travis was their next door neighbor who at times babysat for the kids, so they knew him. And I think the oldest boy had mentioned that Mommy's dead and Carlos is dead. So Travis actually went back to the house and went inside the house and noticed the bodies and immediately called 911.
Police immediately sealed off the house as a crime scene, described by some as the most brutal they had ever seen.
The crime scene in this situation, as you would expect, was extremely brutal, with 2 people being shot point blank. We saw big pools of blood around the persons. We saw a couple shell casings. We saw blood splatter and blood trails throughout the house.
Walking into the room, you have a bed literally right in front of you, and to the right of it is a dresser. And in between the dresser and the bed, you have Tara that's against the wall with her head somewhat propped, lying flat on her back, and Carlos, who is on his side in this large pool of blood. Carlos was shot in the forehead, and Tara was shot somewhat near the back of her head.
It looked as though Tara maybe had time to try to get up off the bed or try to move away from the attacker, but she had also been shot in the head and died instantly.
Tara's face was bruised, almost like she was beaten because of the bruising that went on inside her head because of the bullet.
There was another upsetting discovery at the scene of the crime.
Also in the crime scene was a picture that one of the children must have come in to check on the mother and found the mother and the boyfriend dead. So sad that the child not only saw that, but drew something, a goodbye note almost to the adults, and left it at the crime scene.
Used a crayon to depict Carlos and their mom under tombstones, and another figure firing a firearm with trajectories coming out, and it said, R.I.P. Mom and R.I.P. Carlos. It was indicative that the children had had time with these bodies throughout the majority of that morning, and were unfortunately involved in either making contact with the bodies, or some of the blood that was actually on the floor was actually smeared and moved and disturbed. There was a crayon along with this illustration that was used to diagram it.
I got home from work, and my husband, unfortunately, had been tasked with telling me. He told me what had happened, and I called my mother, but I don't remember anything about the conversation. And then I just remember thinking, I have to tell my father. So at that point, we got in the car and went to the home where my father lives and let him know what had happened. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult. The next few days are a complete blur, and then I was on a plane coming down here to be with my mom. I couldn't imagine, to save my life, how what had happened could have anything to do with Tara. She didn't have an enemy in the world. And I was very ashamed of myself for not being more in the know. It's like, for the first time in our lives together as sisters, I am not 100% privy to what's happening in her world, and I couldn't have picked a worse time to be out of the loop.
This couple had been basically executed in their bedroom. This was just a completely shocking crime that gave police quite a mystery to solve.
As the news of the murders began to circulate, the people of the Florida Keys were horrified at the brutality of the attacks.
Double homicides just don't occur in the Keys like this. This was an execution-style type, home invasion type homicide.
The Florida Keys, the Middle Keys, were absolutely terrified after these crimes, especially people who knew Tara and Carlos because they had no idea what they had gotten into.
The community was in just total fear and panic about what was going on. They wanted answers.
Detectives needed to work quickly to get to the bottom of how and why this brutal murder had happened.
We knew pretty quickly that this wasn't a random home invasion. The house was not ransacked. So we thought pretty early on that this was clearly a targeted assassination.
The deputies that were there had explained one of the significant things that they indicated was that they did not see a weapon.
We were looking obviously for the murder weapon, the gun in this case, the .45 automatic, which we know was used by the shell casing and the rounds that were found in the bodies. But also we thought there was another phone because there was only one phone on the premises.
There was a Apple charger that was plugged into the wall, but there was no Apple phone located at the scene. There was an indication that Carlos's short pockets had been what we use the slang term rabbit-eared, where it's been pulled out. So we knew that either something was pulled out or taken or whatnot.
Only thing taken from the house was a phone, nothing else. So obviously we believed that phone had incriminating evidence that was critical.
What happened to the gun, and where was Carlos's cell phone? What happened to his cell phone?
Detectives and officers approached the enormity of this investigation methodically and with forensic precision. The hunt was on for potential suspects.
Who were the neighbors? Who were their running mates? Who would have a reason to do this? Why had they been in any arrest? Had they been in any battles? Is any ex-lovers? Is this a recent relationship?
Juan Rosado, who was the father of the two younger kids, he had an injunction order against him that was filed by Tara. So he immediately became our #1 person of interest.
He had an ironclad alibi. He had been working at Home Depot. They verified he had worked that night and then gone straight to some friend's house and spent the night there. So pretty quickly they realized that this wasn't a murder related to her divorce from her husband.
Another possible suspect was the neighbor who had actually found the bodies.
Travis Kavutis lived with his parents on Cuba Road.
The police were suspicious of him from the outset. He had cameras set up outside his house to film the streets.
He was paranoid, likely because he was involved in the drug scene as well.
After giving us his equipment, we learned that that night was deleted.
He was insistent he had only done that because he had an automatic system to prevent his computer from getting too full. The footage, he didn't do it on purpose. But there was a while there where he was a prime suspect until they were able to realize there really wasn't a motive or a connection that would have made sense for him to get involved in this.
Travis was ruled out as a suspect, but the footage retrieved from his CCTV cameras would become an invaluable piece of evidence in the case.
The FBI, they were able to get the deleted footage and have it redone so that we were able to view it. Right around 10 o'clock, we see Tara come out and actually move a vehicle from the residence across the street. We also see Carlos pacing up and down the street on this video as well, smoking a cigarette, holding a cell phone. She goes back out. So there's an indication that both of them knew or were awaiting the arrival of some individuals.
There was a big issue with the footage from Travis's cameras. It was grainy. It was very difficult to make out who was in those photographs. I mean, clearly who was in those photographs.
But another key piece of evidence turned up on the phone that was found at the scene.
Very, very early on, the detectives requested of us to look over telephone information. The data was extracted from the phone, and that data was comprised of text messages from the phone itself and videos and photographs from the phone itself.
It was a video clip of a local fisherman by the name of Jeremy McCauley. In the video, Jeremy McCauley is standing in front of basically bricks of cocaine and bragging about how he's become sort of a local drug lord. And this was a very curious clue for police to figure out, why did this video end up on Tara's cell phone? What does Jeremy have to do with Tara? And where did this guy get all these drugs? This is just a guy who's a local fisherman.
Detectives had a number of leads, but were having difficulty connecting the dots. However, they were about to get a break that would start to unravel the mystery of the murders of Tara and Carlos.
When you start to play like you're Pablo Escobar and you're going to be a big drug dealer, there's a lot of risk and gamble.
A visiting holidaymaker was about to give the investigation another break.
A woman was visiting her brother from Miami in Key Largo, and she liked to go swimming in the canal when she came down here to visit. And as she was snorkeling down the canal in Key Largo, she saw a .45 caliber pistol.
And she actually dove down, picked it up, and actually took it back to her residence.
There's a good chance this is a murder weapon. It appeared to be in the water for a short period of time, consistent with the time frame of the murder being going on. So we had sent this off right away to the crime lab.
The firearm actually was placed into a container that contained the same salt water that it was located in that canal. That was transported to FDLE in that condition, in water, where they were able to eventually make the comparison between that firearm and the projectile and the casings that were sent to compare.
You get a shell casing, you get the projectile, and you get the barrel grooves, and they can match the grooves, the rifling, off a barrel, off a shell casing, off the projectile, and even off a firing pin, to where the firing pin hits the back of a primer. So forensically, they were able to determine with 100% accuracy that if you have a gun and you have the shell casing and projectile, they can prove whether that gun fired that bullet.
The casings they found at the murder scene were a definite match for this gun that they found in the canal. So whoever shot Carlos and Tara had dumped this gun in the canal after the murders. So they sent a dive team out there who went all up and down the canal, and sure enough, nearby they found the missing cell phone, Carlos's cell phone.
Obviously, we attempted to get the data from that phone. We were unsuccessful. It was passcode locked, and bottom line is we were unable to get into his phone. The Aces phone that was located at the residence was used as a backup phone. On that Aces phone, which we believe initially came from the iPhone, were videos and all of the texts and all of the data that went back and forth for the 2 or 3 days prior or leading up to these homicides.
We were actually able to see the text messages in complete formation between individuals involved, and we were actually able to view videos that were on the phone. It was as if you had the phone in your hand.
The information again pointed back to Jeremy McCauley, to the local fisherman.
So who was Jeremy McCauley?
Jeremy McCauley, like a lot of fishermen in the Keys, was a guy who had a sort of rough life. He had some run-ins with the law. He'd grown up in St. Petersburg, Florida, with a single mother. His father was a Vietnam vet who had a lot of drug problems. And he'd been arrested as a juvenile with some fairly serious crimes, and I think had tried to restart his life in the Florida Keys.
Jerry McCauley, in this case, he was a mate on a boat called a Seahorse, as a charter fisherman. So his day job that he presented as a legitimate job was working on a boat offshore fishing. And when he wasn't doing that, he was involved heavily in criminal activity, drug use, drug dealing. The sheriff's office knew him and knew his checkered past.
He was also known to be a very good father. He was very close with his children. He had one autistic boy, and he knew that boy needed a routine, and Jeremy was very strict about following that routine in terms of bedtime. He was very dedicated in terms of going to the children's sporting events. He was very close with his family.
As detectives investigated McCauley, they noticed there'd been a sudden change in his lifestyle.
Knowing that Jeremy was the sole provider of his family, his wife, from what we understand, didn't work. He had just purchased her a Dodge Charger, I believe. He had just purchased himself a Chevy Silverado pickup truck. This all on a mate's salary just didn't make sense.
The missing piece in this whole case, the police, took months to find and to track down, was where all this money was coming from that Jeremy McCauley was spending. And they later heard a curious story from other fishermen and people who knew him, which was that he had been out fishing the previous summer, just on a usual trip, off the Keys, and had actually found a huge floating bale of cocaine.
The Florida Keys are only 100 miles north of Cuba. The proximity makes Florida one of the most notorious routes for the importation of narcotics into America.
Not uncommon for drugs to fall off while being loaded from one boat to another, or being airdropped, or a boat have drugs on board and get scared and spooked and throw them overboard because they're afraid to get caught. If you see it, contact the Coast Guard, report it. Do not bring it on board your boat. If you bring it on board your boat and you don't call the Coast Guard and you come into shore, you are importing cocaine in the United States in violation of federal law. And if you get caught, you can't say, oh, I was gonna call you when I got to shore. You're gonna go to prison.
If you're out there every day fishing for a living, you're gonna find drugs floating out there at least every couple years. You have a very difficult choice to make, you know? Do you turn it in? Do you try to sell it? Do you just let it float away at sea? And that's not an easy decision to make.
With the evidence gathered, detectives began piecing together the events which had taken place the previous summer on June the 15th.
Jerry McCauley, along with the other co-conspirators in this case, had come into what we believe a large amount of narcotics, drugs that were found floating while on a charter. They had some clients on board the boat. The captain, the mate, and the clients all agreed to take the cocaine on board the boat. So when they got back and they had the cocaine, they started to do stupid stuff. They were taking pictures with the drugs.
But how did these images end up on Carlos Ortiz's phone?
Jeremy McCauley was not the most organized type of criminal. He perhaps may have been involved in small-time sales of narcotics. So coming into a large portion such as this, I don't think had the wherewithal to know how to get rid of such a large portion, meaning you have to know people that can afford something like that would either be able to break it down or whatnot.
He was a fisherman, he wasn't a cocaine dealer. So if he wanted to try to convert this mysterious package he had found at sea into a profit, he had to find some actual drug dealers to help him sell this product around the Keys and to hopefully do it without getting caught by police.
Carlos was among the several people that Jeremy enlisted to help him sell the cocaine that they found offshore of Islamorada.
Information gathered from the retrieved phone suggested that Carlos and Jeremy were due to meet on the night of the murders.
They found that messages had been going back and forth from them all night long before the murder, and in fact, Jeremy had told Carlos that he was going to come to his house very close to the time they believed the couple was murdered. So yet again, they were looking at Jeremy McCauley.
Looking back over their evidence, could one of the grainy figures in the neighbor's CCTV footage have been Jeremy McCauley?
There was no way we can identify that person just by the imagery we had. However, I will tell you that the person that got out of that passenger seat was Jeremy, because Jeremy's about 6'3", 6'4", and about 300 pounds. There's no way you can tell me that that's someone that's smaller than that, because he towered over the vehicle and he towered over Carlos.
This led to the next major break in the case, which is when a woman came to police and said that she believed it was her car and that she knew the men who had borrowed the car the night of the murder.
This witness would introduce detectives to a new suspect in the case, her roommate, Adrian Demblans.
There was a witness that was living at Adrian Demblans and his girlfriend's house temporarily. She recalls Jeremy McCauley at the residence sometime around 9:30 that night. She wasn't sure how he appeared. Adrian asked if he could borrow her car. She didn't want to let him use it at first, but eventually she did. They both left in the car. Adrian was driving, as she recalled, Jeremy was the passenger. And they left and they were gone for over an hour.
Adrian's girlfriend also came forward and told police what had happened when they returned that evening.
The girlfriend of Adrian Demblans, through different interviews, that suggested that they might have had a little bit of an argument once they returned in that Toyota RAV4 to the residence, where something to the effect that it wasn't supposed to go down like that.
She told police that when they came back, it seemed clear to her that something bad had happened. They were arguing, they seemed to be saying that something had gone wrong. So this was another major tip for police in unraveling this case.
Adrian Demblan's girlfriend also divulged another piece of vital information.
She told them that weeks after the murder, Adrian had a sort of strange request. He asked her to give him a ride to this random canal off of Key Largo and he had all of his diving equipment with him to go diving in the water. And she obviously asked him, what are you doing? Why are you going in this canal? And his story was that he had lost his keys at some point, and he really wanted to find his keys in this canal.
The same canal where the gun and the phone was located. Now understand, nobody in the public was aware that law enforcement had recovered the firearm as well as this phone.
She thought this was strange, but she drove him. He'd go for hours in this water, and she told police that when he came out, he seemed very upset. He hadn't found what he was looking for, and she later heard him on the phone with someone, and she thought she heard him mention a gun.
He actually went to a neighbor and actually got a metal detector right before they left, an underwater metal detector, and that neighbor offered him this. Was told by Adrian that it was going to be used to find either some keys or some sort of jewelry or whatnot that he might have lost.
Another local had actually spotted Demblins diving in that canal with a metal detector, and when they learned that police had found a gun there, they came forward with that information. So her story was corroborated by another witness. What police believe happened is that he had been spooked by the investigation and decided to try to retrieve the murder weapon that had been thrown in this canal, but he went diving and couldn't find it.
Adrian Demblans was now another person of interest to the investigation.
Adrian Demblans is a twin with his brother Christian Demblans. They're wealthy kids from the mainland on Miami-Dade. They're very good wrestlers, went to a private school up there, finished college with bachelor's degrees at Florida International University. Then in college, they started getting involved with drugs. They became junkies, basically.
At some point, Carlos Ortiz knew that he couldn't distribute all these drugs on his own, and that's where the Demblins brothers came in.
This whole gang we talked about that hung around, whether it be Carlos, whether it be Jeremy, whether it be the Demblin brothers, these guys were heavily entrenched in the drug world. So that kind of helped us to narrow down what we're kind of focusing on, what took place or why. So as we looked through the phones, we could determine that there was some type of conspiracy going on between drugs, money, blackmail, extortion.
Detectives were close to catching their men, but the road ahead was not straightforward.
Jeremy McCauley and Carlos Ortiz had actually gone into business together fairly recently. They had rented out a storefront in a little strip mall on Tavernier that he was turning into a tattoo shop.
They're suggesting that it's a good opportunity to open a small business because you can move money through it and you could hide large portions of money and suggest that the business actually made it. So I think Carlos still did have a passion to do tattooing because I know he was doing it on the side, but it also is a business, and perhaps maybe that's why Jeremy McCauley was interested in being able to potentially launder quite a bit of money that was coming in through the proceeds from those drugs.
For a number of weeks, this seemed to have worked fairly well for everybody involved. Jeremy had tons of money all of a sudden, was living a much flashier lifestyle. Carlos was making money and had access to a lot of drugs. And the Demblins brothers seemed to be doing the same. At some point, Carlos started using more and more of the drugs that he was supposed to be selling for Jeremy McCauley, and buying other drugs as well, and basically just completely fell off a cliff in his life. He was spending everything he had, he was taking all the drugs he had, and he needed more. And that's when he basically came to a very desperate decision. He decided he was going to start blackmailing Jeremy McCauley.
Initially, there were a few conversational text messages between Mr. Ortiz and Mr. McCauley, and Mr. Ortiz was requesting monies that Mr. McCauley owed him. Mr. Ortiz became more aggressive in his request for money.
We understood that through the content of these texts and some of the media that was sent, that Carlos was actually extorting Jeremy McCauley.
He had actually compiled quite a bit of evidence against Jeremy McCauley. He had more videos of McCauley posing with drugs. He had photos of him with all this cocaine and money. And then came sort of the clinching text message, which was the day before the murder, when he had started to threaten Jeremy. He basically told him, I'm gonna give this all to the police unless you give me what I want, which is more drugs and money. I think his exact words, he said, you better give me what I want or things are gonna get crazy.
One of the last messages that was sent was an image or a picture that Jeremy had sent, which has the image of a large portion of cash with the hand note that says $4,800 Los, L-O-S. We knew that Los was Carlos, that's his nickname.
The last message that Mr. Ortiz received was from Mr. Macaulay around 10:20 p.m. on the night of the murders, saying that he was on his way.
And then we know that he arrived right around 10:29, 10:30.
Now that they had all these pieces, the footage the police had from the surveillance camera on the street made a lot more sense.
Police now had a solid theory for what had happened that night.
So Jeremy and Macaulay and Adrian basically used this other person's vehicle so that they wouldn't use their own. They pulled up to the house around 10:30. You can see Carlos is outside. He greeted Jeremy on the passenger side. Jeremy walks in with Carlos into the house, and he's in there for about 4 minutes while Adrian waits in the car.
Carlos was very erratic, especially in the weeks leading up to this. The decision to kill him that night was because he was unpredictable. I think they really believed he was going to go to the police with the information about the cocaine.
Jeremy went into the house, murdered Carlos for trying to blackmail him, and killed Tara because she was a witness. Left the scene, and then realized he'd left something, probably a cell phone with the incriminating text messages.
Demblom gets out of the car as Jeremy's coming out. They both go back inside. So they spent a couple minutes. They recovered one phone only. They didn't get the second phone. Left, got in the car, drove away. While driving away is when they threw the gun and threw the phone out. We recovered the gun. We figured out that the means to come to the house were to get the phone that they knew had incriminating pictures of the drugs and money and text messages, and to assassinate the person here who could put the finger on him. So it was really starting to come together, what we had here, a drug deal gone bad in the big scheme of things after an importation case.
Police were now ready to make their arrest.
Police had everything they needed. They basically waited for Jeremy's boat to come into dock after a day of fishing and arrested him on the scene for the murder of Carlos Ortiz and Tara Losada.
That was really a great day for us to be able to say, we got him, we got our man.
But the court case would be anything but straightforward.
The chief prosecutor from Monroe County, Manny Madruga, was the one that was involved from the get-go of this investigation.
He's one of the most experienced prosecutors in the history of this community. But months before this went to trial, he was found dead in his apartment with a gunshot wound to the head. And police later determined that he had actually killed himself. He had recently lost an election to keep his office. He believed that he was going to be fired and apparently was despondent over the whole thing. So suddenly, the lead prosecutor who was going to handle this entire case was dead, which really threw the entire operation into disarray for months.
More complications came when Madruga's replacement was assigned to the case.
New incoming state attorney, Dennis Ward, while a private defense attorney, had consulted with Jeremy Macaulay about this case. So he was involved in the early stage of this case and had a conflict of interest because he was defending Macaulay early on. So he recused himself.
Once the case went to the governor's office for reassignment, it was assigned to the Palm Beach County State Attorney's Office.
Finally, 2 years after the brutal murder of Tara and Carlos, the trial began.
All we wanted at this point was just to have this in the rearview mirror. When you can't get the person you've lost back, all you have left is getting answers. That's the closest you come to peace.
As prosecutors were putting their case together, a lot of the evidence they had was circumstantial, but it did paint a very strong picture of Jeremy Macaulay's involvement in this case. They had the text messages with Carlos the night of the murder. They had the very clear evidence of his involvement with these drugs and trying to sell them. And the murder weapon was also a strong connection.
Part of Jeremy's defense was that he never owned the gun that was used in this crime. But it was later revealed through two different witnesses that he was trying to sell the gun right up until the murders.
There were two people, Snap and Scott, testified and gave evidence, including photographs on their phone, that Jeremy was trying to sell them the gun that he claimed he had sold months prior.
The person had kept the pictures, so we were able to recover the pictures sent from Jeremy's phone to our informant's phone, a picture of the actual murder weapon and the serial numbers. The which helped to tie the gun right into Jeremy. So the case was just really starting to come together.
Even though the prosecution had a very strong case, there were some curveballs thrown at them during the week-long trial. A major one involved Adrian's twin brother, Christian.
There's a last-minute wrench thrown into the prosecutor's case, thanks to Christian Demblins, Adrian's twin brother, who had also been in prison, and his cellmate went to the local sheriffs when he finished his term, and basically said, I have really important information I have to tell you. While I was in this cell with Christian, he confessed to me that Jeremy McCauley was a fall guy who had nothing to do with the murders. He told me that he and his brother had done it themselves. They'd driven to the house, they'd killed them, and that Jeremy knew nothing about this brutal execution.
Lansford had nothing to gain by giving his statement. He was at the tail end of his sentence, and he served his time for a burglary, I believe. And he said the reason he came forward was that he was chilled by the fact that Christian said that had he known the children were even in the house, he would have shot them with no hesitation.
For Jeremy's defense, this was just a gift from the heavens. You know, this was a witness saying that he had heard a confession that completely cleared Jeremy McCauley of involvement.
Things were up in the air for the prosecution until the biggest turning point came in the trial.
The prosecutor's biggest victory came when they convinced Adrian Demblins to flip on Jeremy McCauley. They offered him a deal to plead down to a lesser charge in exchange for testifying that he had been the driver and that he had taken Jeremy to the house that night of the murders.
Everything we thought happened, we had it nailed. We had this plot about what took place to the T. He was able to verify, we did this, I drove, we borrowed the car, we went here, we threw the gun there. They even talked about trying to find the gun later on.
After a week-long trial, the jury deliberation took just 2 hours.
Considering it was a week-long trial and all the evidence that was provided, the jury came back within less than an hour and a half.
The state had already taken the death penalty off the table in the case, so he wasn't eligible for death, but he was hit with 2 life sentences for the murders.
Her family was hoping she would just focus at that point, after the divorce, on her children, on getting her life together, on working, just basically being boyfriend-free for a while.
We'll likely never walk another day on this earth, at least not in our environment.
Adrian Demblins pleaded guilty to 2 counts of accessory to murder and was sentenced to 10 years. Jeremy McCauley was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 life sentences to be served one after another.
Knowing that those children eventually were sitting with her for hours potentially, mourning their death in whatever capacity young children do at that age, and trying to understand it and put it together, if it didn't play on him, then he has no soul.
Nothing in his eyes or his demeanor or anything about the way he carried himself implied an apology. The fact that he had a family actually broke my heart. I hated hearing that. It just perplexed me because I don't understand how someone with a family of their own could strike out at someone with kids like that.
The judge had an incredibly powerful statement as he sentenced Jeremy. He basically called him the judge, jury, and executioner in this case. And he pointed out that really the worst victims in this whole thing were the 3 children who were in the house. You know, not only did they have to live through this just incredibly traumatic experience of their mother being murdered and being locked in the house with these bodies for hours afterwards, but as he told Jeremy, he basically sentenced them to a life without a mother, and a life with living with everything they'd seen in this case. The judge didn't limit it to Tara's children. He pointed out that, Jeremy had actually sentenced his own children to life without a father in making this decision to commit this horrible crime.
By the end of the trial, though, despite everything, there was a sense in that family that it was over. There was closure. They could finally begin to move on, properly mourn, finally make a better life for the children.
There was no indication initially or even throughout the investigation that Tara had anything to do with this whole situation. She was never the target of this, I don't believe. She wasn't involved. She just was a victim of circumstance. She was at the wrong place at the wrong time, potentially witnessed a murder and had to be silenced for it.
Since it's over, we're able to kind of get back to normal a little bit as much as you can. I mean, it's hard because she's everywhere. Down here, we have memories everywhere we go. But we're trying our best to start looking at that like it's a nice thing, like it's more of a blessing than a curse. And just to see the kids as happy here as they are, it really helps. It makes a big difference. But I know they miss her.